Ever wonder what it was really like to live in a different time and place?
Yeah, like stepping back into history and experiencing it firsthand.
Exactly. Well, today we're going to do just that. We're taking a deep dive into Arkansas, specifically Ashley County, during the mid-19th century.
So between 1850 and 1866.
Right. And what makes this so interesting is we have these two great sources. We've got a general history of Arkansas from that period, and then this really detailed history of Ashley County written by Y.W. Etheridge.
Having both perspectives is amazing. We can see how things were happening across the whole state, but then zoom in on Ashley County and see how those trends played out in a specific community.
It's like having a wide-angle lens and then a close-up, right? And our goal is to weave these together so you can get a feel for what life was actually like back then, beyond just names and
It's about
dates.
getting to the texture of life,
Yeah,
right? Like, what were people worried about? What were they excited about? How did they make a living?
exactly. We're going to explore the economy, infrastructure, social customs, and of course, the looming presence and then the reality of the Civil War.
It's a fascinating period of transformation, and starting in 1850 gives us a great baseline. So let's jump in. What does Etheridge tell us about Ashley County at that time?
Okay, so 1850. Paint us a picture. What was Ashley County like?
Well, it was definitely still a developing area, on the frontier. The population was about 2,058 white residents and 644 enslaved people.
So right away, that tells you something about the social and economic structure.
Oh, absolutely. Enslaved labor was a huge part of the economy.
And we even have some specific prices that really bring it to life. Like a prime enslaved person could be sold for between $1,300 and $2,000.
Wow. And at the same time, land was going for like $20 to $50 an acre.
Huge difference. Cotton, of course, was a major crop, selling for 10 to 15 cents a pound.
Those prices really put you in that time and place. And it wasn't just about agriculture. You start to see signs of infrastructure developing too.
Oh, yeah, like what?
Well, Etheridge mentions a free county bridge, which would have been a big deal for transportation. And then another bridge across Chimanihot Creek, built for just 75 bucks.
$75. That's amazing.
Even little things like liquor licenses tell you something about the community. Like Robert J. Noble and James Bradford. They each paid $15 for their licenses in Hamburg.
Gives you a glimpse into the social scene, right?
Exactly. And the courthouse in Hamburg, Etheridge, describes it so vividly. It was 2 stories tall, with offices downstairs and the courtroom upstairs. No fence around it, but these massive sycamore trees providing shade.
So people would just hitch their animals, their teams, horses, mules, oxen under the trees. I can almost picture it.
Yeah, that's a great image. And it's interesting that even then, the county was already a little bit in debt, about $109 actually.
Really? What caused that?
Seems like it was mostly due to the cost of building the courthouse. Makes sense. They needed a proper place for government functions. Later on, we see things becoming more organized in terms of communication. Postal services, for example. In Fountain Hill, William Hughes was appointed postmaster in 1856.
Taking over from Elijah Kirkpatrick.
Yeah. But then Hughes was only in the job for a few months. William Daniel took over in September of that same year.
So a little bit of turnover there.
Right. But it shows how things were starting to solidify. And speaking of things solidifying, even during the Civil War, some local industries kept going.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, the Carlock and Pyron Tannery, west of Hamburg, they were still operating in 1863.
Under the Confederate government.
Yep, assessed at $1,500.
So they were likely contributing to the war effort in some way.
Most likely.
Mm.
So that's a snapshot of Ashley County in 1850.
So we've got Ashley County in 1850. Now, what about Arkansas as a whole? What was going on at the state level?
Well, one of the most remarkable things happening was this push for education.
Oh, right. Tell me about that.
So the Auditor of State, Elias N. Conway, he was really behind this initiative to distribute books to counties all over Arkansas.
What kind of books are we talking about?
Well, all kinds. Primers, spellers, like Webster's Elementary Spelling Book, history books like Willard's History of the U.S., geographies by Morse, grammar books, dictionaries, arithmetic texts, even slates and pencils.
That's a pretty comprehensive collection. Sounds like they were serious about education.
Absolutely. They wanted to create a more informed citizenry, and they were giving people the tools to do that. And, it's interesting to compare this with the literacy rates in Ashley County at the time.
Yeah, how did they measure up?
Well, back then, Ashley County was often considered part of Drew County in some records. But even with that, they had a remarkably low rate of adult illiteracy. Only 46 individuals were recorded as illiterate.
Wow, that's impressive, especially considering there weren't many public schools yet.
Right. A lot of education relied on traveling teachers. They called them itinerant masters.
It makes you wonder how people were learning if they didn't have formal schooling.
Yeah, maybe through their families, church groups, things like that. Now, for a state like Arkansas, with all its rivers and waterways, transportation must have been a major concern.
Oh, absolutely. So, what were the main arteries of travel?
The Wichita River and Bayou Bartholomew were crucial.
I can just imagine the sound of steamboats plying those waters.
Right, and you needed skilled pilots and captains to navigate them. Those waterways were the lifelines connecting communities, especially since roads were still pretty basic.
But they were working on it. There's mention of a road built in 1850 connecting Fountain Prairie, Berea to Holloway's Landing.
Steps in the right direction. And before that grand courthouse in Hamburg was finished, they needed a place for government business.
Right, right. So, what did they do?
They actually built a temporary seat of justice, a simple log structure, only 18 by 24 feet, with a stacked chimney. Cost them $200.
A far cry from that two-story courthouse. But it shows how they made do with what they had.
Right, they were resourceful. So that's 1850 in Arkansas. A growing commitment to education, an economy deeply tied to agriculture, and communities linked by these vital waterways, all while navigating the complexities of a society with a large enslaved population.
It's a fascinating snapshot. Now let's fast forward a bit into the decade before the Civil War, the early 1860s. Things were heating up across the nation, and we know a war is coming. So how did those national tensions play out in Ashley County? How did the county change in those years?
Well, one of the biggest changes was in the population. Between 1850 and 1860, the white population in Ashley County more than doubled, reaching 4,829.
Wow, that's a lot of growth.
Yeah. And at the same time, the enslaved population also jumped significantly, up to 3,761.
So more than double on both sides.
Right, which tells us something really important about how the economy was evolving. Enslaved labor was becoming even more central to the way things worked.
And this was happening as tensions over slavery were rising on the national stage.
Exactly. And you can see those tensions reflected locally. Like, Etheridge mentions this guy, Captain James W. Clark. He was a slave owner contractor involved in clearing land.
Shows how intertwined slavery was with everyday life and the economy.
For sure. And it wasn't just economic tensions. There was a sense of fear and uncertainty in the air.
Yeah, people must have known something was coming.
Absolutely. And there were even incidents of violence, like at Sim Harris's Lake, northeast of town on Schmanahout Creek. The militia ended up shooting and killing some men who were just watering their horses.
That's terrible. Just a tragic example of how things were escalating.
It really was. And when the war finally broke out, Ashley County didn't hesitate to contribute to the Confederate cause. They provided at least 13 captains for the Confederate Army.
13 captains from one county. That's quite a number.
Yeah, and some pretty well-known names, too. Guys like William W. Tebbs, Van H. Manning, James W. Horton.
Etheridge must have done some serious research to compile all that.
He really did. And here's another interesting tidbit. The very first two companies raised in Arkansas for the Confederacy, they actually came from Ashley County.
Really?
Yep. Formed in early May 1861. One company had 118 men from the western part of the county, and the other had 82 from the eastern side.
So they were ready to fight.
Well, there was actually a bit of hesitation at first, but ultimately they ended up joining the Confederate service.
It's fascinating to think about what those men must have been feeling. A mix of excitement, fear, maybe even some doubt.
It was a complex time, for sure. And as the war went on, you see how the local economy had to adapt.
Oh, yeah, like how?
Well, remember that tannery we talked about, Carlock and Pyron?
Yeah, the one that was still operating in 1863.
Right, so during the war, it became a government project. And there's even evidence that they might have been getting fruit oil from the Saline and Oneida rivers for their operations.
So they were directly supporting the war effort.
It seems likely. But alongside all the big picture stuff, Etheridge also gives us these glimpses into individual lives,
Yeah.
which is what makes it so real.
Right. It's not just about dates and battles. It's about people.
Exactly. Like, there's a story about this guy, Bodie Honeycutt. He apparently had a bit of a rough past, but then he had this kind of religious conversion and became a well-respected member of the community, known for his hospitality and generosity.
That's a nice little story. A glimmer of hope amidst all the turmoil.
Right. And then there's Bill Rowe, who came from Tennessee and settled in Crossett. He promised to give up his illicit liquor business and ended up becoming friends with Captain W.F. Gates.
Those little details make it so much more vivid, don't they?
They really do. And we even get insights into the social dynamics of slavery. Like, Etheridge talks about how practices for slave marriages could differ depending on how many enslaved people a person owned.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have thought about that.
And we also see the emergence of early black religious leaders. Like Green Wemberly was licensed to preach in the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
So Ashley County was changing in big ways as the war approached. And what about the rest of Arkansas? What was happening across the state?
Well, the sentiment for secession was definitely gaining traction. It was becoming clear that Arkansas was going to side with the Confederacy.
So a lot of division and uncertainty, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. And there were key figures who really embodied that commitment to the Confederacy, like Judge Marcus L. Hawkins, for instance.
What did he do?
Well, he served in the Confederate Army, but then later he also took part in constitutional conventions, really shaping the future of the state. And as news of battles started filtering in from other parts of the country, you can imagine the anxiety and fear that people must have felt.
Must have been nerve-wracking, waiting for the war to come to your doorstep.
Exactly. Etheridge even mentions how some folks in Ashley County mistook random sounds for Yankee troops. That's how on edge they were.
So by the early 1860s, both Ashley County and Arkansas were in this state of rapid change and growing tension. The population was booming, enslaved labor was becoming even more entrenched, and everyone was bracing for the inevitable conflict. It's a fascinating period leading up to the Civil War itself. So let's dive into those war years, from 1861 to 1865. What was it like for the people of Ashley County during that tumultuous time?
It must have been a period of incredible upheaval. Etheridge really brings those experiences to life through the stories he tells.
Like what kind of stories?
Well, for example, there's a story of Marshal John R. Hoy from Hamburg. He fought under the command of Patrick Cleburne.
Cleburne, the Confederate general.
That's the one. Cleburne was a really important figure in the Confederate military. So you have this local guy, Hoy, fighting under one of the top generals. It really connects Ashley County to the larger conflict.
It's a direct link to the battlefield.
And then there's stories about the efforts to control resources, like cotton. There was illegal trading going on, and Captain Daniel tried to crack down on that before he was discharged for medical reasons.
Makes sense. During wartime, resources become even more precious.
Absolutely. But one of the most striking things that Etheridge talks about is the sense of hopelessness that a lot of soldiers felt when they returned home after the war.
Yeah, you can imagine the trauma they must have experienced. And coming back to a world that had been completely changed by the war.
It's heartbreaking.
Okay.
And the war really did change everything. Communities were shattered. The economy was in shambles. It must have been incredibly difficult to rebuild their lives.
And it wasn't just the physical destruction. There were deep social divisions.
Oh, yeah. Tensions were running high. And there's this story that really illustrates that. A man in Ashley County was actually mistaken for a black person by the militia. It shows just how chaotic and dangerous things were. Racial tensions were exacerbated by the war, and people were quick to jump to conclusions.
A really unsettling time.
But Etheridge also mentions that eventually the calmer elements on both sides started to gain influence.
So things did start to settle down a bit.
To some extent, yes. There was a gradual move toward reconciliation. Ex-Confederates started taking oaths of allegiance to the Union. And it's important to remember that Ashley County was already in debt before the war.
Right, you mentioned that earlier.
So imagine how much worse their financial situation must have been after the war. It would have been a real struggle to recover.
Makes sense. So we've got individuals returning from the war, facing a whole new reality. But what about the broader impact? How did the war change the landscape and communities of Ashley County?
Well, it left its mark in some pretty profound ways. Etheridge describes deserted villages, whole communities abandoned because of the war. It's a stark reminder of the displacement and disruption that people experienced. And he also mentions the growth of pine trees over what used to be plantations, almost like nature was reclaiming the land that had been so violently disrupted.
That's a powerful image. And he talks about specific communities, right? Like Marie Celine Township.
Yeah. By 1860, there were only 56 families living there, and just one merchant, a guy named J.M. Bond. And Fountain Hill, another small community. One of the early merchants there, Elisha Kirkpatrick, he retired in 1860. David Cohn, he had a store there back in 1849, sold things like sugar. These were the hubs of these little communities.
And Longview.
Right, Longview had Captain Philip Durden, who started a mercantile business there back in 1846. The John W. Downey family settled there in 1850. So you see these little pockets of communities springing up. And of course, Hamburg, being the county seat, was a little more established. But even there, the war took its toll.
I remember you mentioning Colonel F.S. Files, the merchant who was arrested when he came back from New Orleans.
Yes. His story is a perfect example of how the war could disrupt even the most successful lives. They seized all his goods.
Must have been devastating.
But you know what's amazing? He went on to become the auditor of state and even ran for governor. Talk about resilience.
That's incredible. A real testament to his character.
It really is. And even as the war raged on, the legal and social battles over slavery continued. Like there was this lawsuit in 1855 filed by William McCaskill. It challenged the status of certain individuals who were being claimed as slaves. So even in the midst of the war, these fundamental issues were still being debated.
It was a period of immense upheaval in so many ways.
Definitely. The Civil War was a turning point in American history, and its effects on Ashley County were profound. People lost loved ones, communities were torn apart, the economy was devastated. But there were also glimmers of hope, acts of resilience, stories of people coming together, and ultimately the promise of a new beginning.
Now, that new beginning came with its own set of challenges. Reconstruction. A time of rebuilding, but also a time of continued struggle and social change. So what happened in Ashley County during those immediate post-war years from 1865 to 1866? What did Reconstruction look like on the ground?
Well, one of the most significant developments was the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau. It was a federal agency created specifically to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom.
A massive undertaking.
Absolutely. And they were involved in all sorts of things, setting up schools, overseeing labor contracts between freed people and landowners, and protecting their legal rights.
Sounds like they had their work cut out for them.
No kidding. And it wasn't always smooth sailing. Etheridge mentions that the Freedmen's Bureau wasn't all that popular in Ashley County.
Really? Why not?
Well, it seems like there was resistance from both black and white communities. Remember, this was a time of deep racial prejudice, and the transition from slavery to a free labor system was incredibly complex. Not everyone embraced the changes. There were bound to be tensions.
Makes sense. Do we have any specific examples of what the Freedmen's Bureau was doing in Ashley County?
We do. There's mention of a contract from January 1867 between Henry Morsheimer and some black laborers near Parkdale. It outlines the terms of their employment, so it gives you a sense of how the Bureau was trying to formalize these new working relationships.
So trying to create a fair and structured system for everyone.
Exactly. But despite the presence of federal troops and what Etheridge calls turncoats and scalawags.
And for those who don't know, scalawags was a term used to describe white Southerners who cooperated with Reconstruction.
Right. So despite those influences, conservatives in Ashley County still managed to win elections. In fact, J.W. Moore and George C. Norman were even elected as delegates to the Constitutional Convention in 1868. So you can see there was still a strong push for local control and a desire to shape the post-war political landscape according to their own vision.
So Reconstruction wasn't just dictated from above, it was a complex interplay of local and national forces.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, the violence didn't completely end with the war. There's this really disturbing incident where the head of the Freedmen's Bureau was shot at near the Presbyterian Church.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a close call. Apparently, a 17-year-old boy from the Berlin community was responsible. It just shows how much resentment and resistance there was to the changes brought about by Reconstruction.
And how dangerous it was for those trying to implement those changes.
No doubt. We also see that the authorities were trying to restore order. Powell Clayton, a big player in Arkansas politics at the time, he issued orders to General W.F. Mallory to go after outlaws. Basically told him to arrest them and safely execute them.
Wow, no messing around.
Nope. And General Mallory, he has this kind of humorous anecdote about his malicious actions in Drew and Ashley counties. He claimed that they confiscated all these weapons, shotguns, buckshot, powder, percussion caps, but that they got stuck in the Ouachita River.
Sounds a little suspicious, if you ask me.
Yeah, there were definitely some shady dealings going on during Reconstruction. It wasn't always a clean process. So on the state level, there were these different visions for how to rebuild Arkansas and bring it back into the Union. You had the presidential Reconstruction plans, which were more lenient, and then the congressional Reconstruction plans favored by the radical Republicans, which were much more stringent. Ultimately, it was the congressional plan that prevailed.
A more hardline approach.
Yeah. And as part of that, there were local elections held in Ashley County in 1866. We see familiar names like J.R. Lawson and our friend Colonel F.S. Files getting elected to county offices.
Yeah.
So despite the turmoil, there was this attempt to reestablish some form of local governance.
It was a really complex and challenging period. But now I'm curious about the everyday lives of people in Ashley County. We've talked about the big political and economic shifts, but what about the details of their daily existence? What did they eat? How did they spend their time? What were their homes like?
Well, luckily, Etheridge provides a wealth of information about those everyday details, and it's fascinating to get a glimpse into that world.
So let's talk food. What were people eating back then?
It seems like they were pretty resourceful. Roasting acorns was a common practice, and corn pone was a staple. And of course, catfish was a big part of the diet.
Fresh from the rivers.
Exactly. And preserving food was really important. They would jerk meat and pickle it. And Etheridge even mentions that the pickling brine had to be strong enough to float an egg. That's how you knew it was good and salty.
Wow, that's a pretty vivid image. So what about hunting? Was that a big part of life?
Oh yeah, hunting was huge, both for food and for the local economy. Deer and bear were plentiful, and bear was especially valuable. The oil, the pelt, the meat, everything.
Sounds like a tough but rewarding way of life.
It was. And they often hunted with packs of hounds. Must have been quite a sight. But there were dangers too. Like wolves preying on livestock was a constant worry. Home life back then revolved around self-sufficiency, making soap from scratch, drying fruits, using gourds as containers. These were all common practices.
And I bet quilting was a popular activity.
You bet. It was both practical and social. And Etheridge mentions that older women often took the lead in quilting, sharing their skills and stories. And, even something like digging a well could be a community effort. If someone needed a well, everyone would pitch in to help. And when a new house was built, they'd have a big housewarming party to celebrate. It was a way for the community to come together and support each other.
So a strong sense of community. What about social activities? How did people entertain themselves?
Well, they love their dances. Play parties and square dances were really popular, although some churches weren't too happy about the newer dances, like waltzes and two-steps. Etheridge mentions that Mount Olive Baptist Church even disciplined some members for dancing those dances.
So a little bit of controversy over dancing.
Always. Singing games were popular, too, like one called Oh, That Girl, That Pretty Little Girl. And of course, commerce played a big role in daily life. But the stores back then were much smaller and had a much more limited selection of goods.
Yeah, you're not going to find a Walmart in 1850s Arkansas. So what kind of things did they sell?
Think basic necessities. Tobacco, snuff, maybe some simple candies. Bartering was common, and credit was often extended. Etheridge actually includes a list of items from David Cohn's store in 1849. It's fascinating to see what a typical store inventory looked like back then.
That's a great primary source. It really brings it to life. And of course, we can't talk about daily life without mentioning religion.
Absolutely. Religion was at the heart of these communities. Etheridge talks about the importance of churches, the debates between different denominations like the Christians and the Baptists, and even cases of church discipline. Like, there's this guy, Brother Riley, who had to apologize to the church for drinking too much. Even ministers weren't immune to a little bit of vice. Etheridge mentions that some of them even took whiskey or wine with them when they traveled to conferences.
Well, a little liquid courage never hurt, right? So we've got cotton as the main cash crop, but what else were people growing?
Tobacco and beeswax were both important, and honey production was a big deal too. They would keep bees in hollowed-out logs called gums. And when they harvested the honey, they would divide it up, which suggests a sense of sharing and community.
Makes sense. And what about livestock?
Hogs and cattle were the mainstays, and they often let their animals roam freely on the range, identifying them with ear markings. Later on, they started to focus on improving livestock breeds, introduced new varieties of chickens, like native Rapicolas and buff Cochins. And Jersey cattle were also becoming more popular.
Always looking to innovate. And what about education? We talked about those books being distributed, but what did a typical school day look like?
Well, a lot of it was rote memorization, like learning geography by repeating lists of places and spelling by chanting syllables. Later on, they started using McGuffey's readers, but good penmanship was highly valued. And they had these things called singing schools, where people could learn vocal music.
So a focus on practical skills and the arts. And what about healthcare?
There were doctors, like Dr. Newton and Dr. Comer, but I imagine most people relied on home remedies and traditional practices for everyday ailments. And of course, getting around wasn't easy. They relied heavily on ferries to cross the rivers and bayous.
Like Phillips Ferry, Holloway's Ferry.
Right? And travel during times of high water was especially difficult. It could really disrupt life. So overall, you get this picture of a society that was deeply connected to its environment. They relied on their own skills and ingenuity, and they really depended on each other to get by. It was a challenging but also a rewarding way of life.
It's amazing to think about how much has changed in just a few generations. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Ashley County in Arkansas during this pivotal period, what are the big takeaways? What should we remember about this era?
Well, I think it's a powerful reminder that history isn't just about grand events and famous figures. It's also about the everyday lives of ordinary people.
Mm.
And when we focus on a specific place and time, like we did today with Ashley County, we can really start to understand what those lives were like. We can see the challenges they faced, the choices they made, and the resilience they showed in the face of adversity.
It's a story of growth, transformation, and ultimately survival. From those early days of settlement and development, through the tumultuous years of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the people of Ashley County left an indelible mark on the history of Arkansas. And their stories continue to resonate with us today.
And it makes you wonder, how did their experiences compare to what was happening in other parts of the South? What were the similarities and what were the unique aspects of life in Ashley County? It's a question worth exploring further.
Absolutely. And as we think about the legacy of this era, it's also worth considering how those events, those struggles, and those triumphs continue to shape Arkansas today. What echoes of the past can we still see in the present? That's something for all of us to ponder.
It's a reminder that history is never truly in the past. It's always with us, shaping our present and influencing our future.
So true. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Ashley County in Arkansas during the mid-19th century. We hope you found it as insightful and fascinating as we did. And we encourage you to keep exploring history, both locally and beyond. There are always more stories to be discovered, more connections to be made, and more lessons to be learned.
Happy exploring.
Until next time.